Hi y'all, welcome to our Thursday Manhood and Masculinity lecture, and also to my birds screeching very heavily in the background. Sorry about that. Today we're going to be continuing a conversation that we started on Tuesday about masculinity and indeed about changing gender roles more generally during the Cold War period. So what does gender look like? What are the expectations for people in the decades after World War II? And so one of the things we had mentioned last class is that if you are a sort of red-blooded American man or a good American woman during the 1940s and 50s, then what you would really be expected to strive for was something that looked very much like this. You were supposed to derive most of your satisfaction from being a spouse, from being a parent, and from creating a safe, happy, and well-provisioned household. And for men in particular, we said this marked a fairly significant change from previous sort of definitions of masculinity. As much as we think of 1950s households as being kind of traditional American households, they were in fact not. And one of the ways in which they are profoundly not traditional is that we know from this class that men in the 19th century and even the early 20th century were expected to define themselves a lot by their public roles. So what were they doing in the workplace? What were they doing on sports teams? What were they doing outside of the house that showed that they were valuable, independent, capable, etc.? In the 1950s, of course, this is going to be very different. Now it's what you do within the house that is the most important, and work and other things that may have been a source of value for you before are now sort of a means to an end, and that end is supporting a family. And so we mentioned last class, among other things, that the idea of being a risk taker, of being independent, became something that was less revered in American culture at this time. Now, at the end of last class, I mentioned to you that this ideal of the happy home, the happy family, did satisfy a lot of people, but it also created a number of anxieties among American men, and this should be a familiar trend to us by this point, right? Anytime there are changes in what it means to be a man, there are going to be some people who respond to that by perceiving a kind of crisis in American manhood. And certainly that was the case for some people in the 1950s, especially. And I mentioned to you at the end of last class this book, The Lonely Crowd, by David Reisman, who was a lawyer turned sociologist. And I went over some of Reisman's argument, but I just wanted to briefly return to that and reinforce what we said as a means of entering today's conversation. So again, Reisman made a kind of historical argument about the trajectory of American masculinity, that initially people had been tradition-driven, and I shouldn't say he's writing just about masculinity, he's really not, but he's writing that people used to be tradition-driven, and then they became, with the rise of capitalism, inner-directed. And the metaphor he used for this, by the way, was that of a gyroscope. If you've ever seen a gyroscope, it's a kind of internal balancer, right? It always maintains its stability. If you were an inner-directed person living in the 19th century, then chances are that you would measure your worth, you would develop your sense of self primarily based on traditions that were instilled in you or the way you were raised as a child, but regardless, you had a strong kind of internalized sense of who you were. You defined yourself in your own terms. However, Reisman suggested that by the mid-20th century, Americans had made a transition to being primarily outer-directed people. And so if our inner-directed person had a gyroscope, our outer-directed person worked through radar. That was Reisman's metaphor. And as you know, with radar, you kind of emit pulses of sound and wait to see how they bounce off of various objects around you in order to locate yourself. Reisman said this is essentially what Americans did in order to figure out who they were as people and how they were doing in life. They were constantly measuring themselves in terms of what other people thought and believed. They wanted to fit into the crowd instead of having a strong and defined internal sense of self. They were constantly looking for external validation. And I want to note for you that Reisman's text gets used and misused in quite a lot of different ways. among other things, it gets seized on by a lot of people who treat it as a kind of text of anti-conformity. In other words, saying that Reisman was critiquing this outer directedness as shallow, as saying it's dangerous to have no sense of yourself, to always be measuring yourself with other people, that this is a horrible conformist thing that's smothering and stifling for people, especially for men who are being feminized by this tendency to feel pressured to be agreeable, to fit in, etc. Right? By people who are sort of yearning for the loss of the self-made man, this becomes a kind of very negative thing. I want to note that Reisman, though, didn't necessarily see it that way. Reisman was not morally weighing in on the validity of any of these particular types, inner directed or outer directed. Instead, he just said, I'm observing a pattern. And he particularly said there's actually strengths of both of these types, right? There are good things about being inner directed, and there are also good things about being outer directed. I mean, agreeableness and desire to cooperate with other people isn't a bad thing, right? And similarly, Reisman said, this idea that somehow we're more conformist now than we used to be is just not quite true. I mean, even inner-directed people are conformist. They just have a different source of conformity. With them, it's tradition and what they've been taught and what they've internalized as children. And with outer-directed people, it's, a kind of constant feedback cycle that's promoted, among other things, by media, right? We're constantly measuring ourselves. But they're both conformists, right? Nobody who lives in a society is outside of the influence of other people. And so Reisman himself did not see sort of outer directedness as necessarily a bad thing. And yet a lot of people really did. And a lot of people, particularly men, are going to seize on his kind of formulation of outer directed men to argue that American men are in crisis, or, as one series of articles published in Look magazine in the 1950s claimed, they're in decline. There was a series of articles called The Decline of the American Male. And they're saying that, not the least of which, because, again, some of the characteristics of outer directedness are characteristics that are feminized. And so I want to talk today, as we go through the class, about sort of two alternate approaches to dealing with these anxieties that American men were somehow becoming less than, that they were becoming too conformist, that they were losing their sense of rugged individualism. And the first one of those that I want to bring up with you as a kind of interesting approach is one posed by the historian and essayist Arthur Schlesinger. Now, if you've taken a lot of AP US history classes or even college-level history classes, you might have read something by Schlesinger at one point, because he's a very prominent sort of thinker and public intellectual of the mid-20th century. But one thing that Schlesinger did was he actually wrote a kind of well-known article called The Crisis of Masculinity in 1958, The Crisis of American Masculinity. And it's actually a really interesting piece. I sort of wish I had assigned it as reading, but alas, I didn't, so I will just introduce you to it. So Schlesinger starts this essay with a question, right? What has happened to the American male? All right, so already we have a kind of sense of crisis here, right? We seldom ask what has happened to something if we don't perceive that it's gone wrong somewhere along the way. So what has happened to the American male? Schlesinger went on to say, for a long time he seemed utterly confident in his manhood, sure of his masculine role in society, easy and definite in his sense of sexual identity. The frontiersmen of James Fenimore Cooper, for example, never had any concern about masculinity. They are men, and it did not occur to them to think twice about it. Now, this is a kind of interesting historical argument in light of what we've studied in this class, because, if anything, what we've come to the conclusion, or what a lot of historians of masculinity have concluded, is that actually American manhood has undergone a lot of crises, or at least perceived crises, if we're to take Toby Dietz's criticism seriously, which I think we should, of what it means to be a man, right? There are always multiple versions of this. There are always anxieties about not being good enough, particularly in the industrial age. And so I think maybe we could critique Schlesinger a little bit on this point that, there was some period in the past where American manhood was secure. But Schlesinger was noting some interesting things. Part of the reason he says definite in his sense of sexual identity when describing American men is that Schlesinger was perceiving more than ever that men were becoming concerned not just about their ability to measure up, but concerned about the stability of the category of manhood. And one of the reasons that Schlesinger perceived that masculinity was in crisis during the Cold War is that he noticed that there was quite a bit of public obsession with both homosexuality and transsexualism, particularly in the sort of McCarthy years. So if we're to look at what's going on with these two sort of social phenomena during this period, one thing we can see if we look in the 1950s is that there's a kind of obsession with the concept that there are sort of secretive homosexuals who are undermining society. And if you know anything about sort of HUAC and McCarthyism and all of this stuff, you know that there was a lot of federal and congressional targeting of alleged homosexuals, attempts to boot them from the federal government, etc. And the reason that people were so concerned with homosexuality, as I've said in a previous lecture, had a lot to do with its associations with communism. There were a lot of parallels between queer men and communists, at least in the popular imagination. So, for instance, both groups were allegedly, quote-unquote, enslaved to their desires in the case of gay men, or to their governments in the case of communists, right, to an ideology. They both passed, quote unquote, while secretly subverting society. So they're both people who hide parts of themselves in order to appear normal and get by, right? Soviet spies and gay people. They both lead these kind of furtive lives, right? Secretive meetings in dark alleys, etc. are common to both groups, at least in the popular imagination, and probably accurately. And queer people could be blackmailed for secrets, right? It was thought that if you were gay, you were inherently a security risk because you would want to conceal that fact, and therefore the Soviets would have something to hold over you that they might be able to pressure you into giving up government secrets, etc. Now, never mind that if the stigma of homosexuality hadn't existed, this wouldn't be a thing. But the federal government responded by really reinforcing this stigma, and it gets a lot of news coverage. McCarthy and other conservatives claim that they have these lists of homosexuals in government positions, and the State Department has a mass firing of more than 400 people suspected to be gay in 1953. Were they? Who knows? But there's this kind of paranoia about this danger that these people pose. And there's a whole lavender scare that's about getting these quote-unquote lavender lads, as McCarthy describes them, out of government positions. He's obsessed with it. And of course, Eisenhower will end up signing an executive order 10450, which barred homosexuals from government work. You could not be a federal employee if you were gay or even suspected of being gay if anything came up in your security clearance. So this was a big public obsession, the dangers of homosexuality, and Schlesinger noted this. He also noticed that there was a public obsession with Christine Jorgensen. And Christine Jorgensen had been assigned male at birth, had served as a GI in World War II, and subsequently came out as transsexual, as she identified at the time. This is a less commonly used word today, but there are still people who embrace it. Basically, she decided to quote-unquote become a woman, and you see that here in this poster, right? The first man to become a woman. Nowadays, we would not say become a woman, right? If you identify as a woman, you are a woman. But she had at the time what was the first kind of major and highly publicized quote unquote sex change or quote unquote sex reassignment surgery. Nowadays, we would say gender confirmation surgery in most cases. But this this case, Jorgensen becomes a really big media sensation. It gets a lot of public attention. People are just incredibly fascinated by this story of this person who quote unquote changes sex. And so Schlesinger looks at this and says, why are we so interested in these things? Why is there this public obsession with homosexuality, with furtively effeminate men, with transsexualism during this period? And he says that this is part of a larger constellation of anxieties about the meaning of sex and the instability of the category of sex. What does it mean to be a man or a male in modern society? And he said this is a result of the fact that really we all feel a little bit unstable in our sexual identities during this particular period, and he wanted to know why. And he had a kind of interesting explanation for this. He explained it in terms of the development of Western society and more specifically the freedom that came with it. So in a statement that kind of echoed Reisman's concept that a tradition-oriented society had faded by the 19th century, Schlesinger wrote, quote, "Modern Western society, free, equalitarian, democratic, has swept away all the old niches in which people for so many centuries found safe refuge. Only a few people at any time in human history have enjoyed the challenge of making themselves. Most have fled from the undurable burden of freedom into the womb-like security of the group." And so Schlesinger says, look, this is what Americans are doing. We live in an unusually prosperous society, in a democratic society, in an equalitarian society where there is opportunity for so many people to define themselves. And of course, I should insert here, not equal opportunity for everyone, right? But he says essentially, freedom is scary. The freedom to define yourself is kind of terrifying. It is a burden. And in the face of that burden, a lot of people just want to fit in. They feel an absence of the sense of self. They don't have a well-developed internal sense of self that enables them to feel secure in their sex or in their sexual identity. And so Schlesinger had a prescription to fix this. And interestingly enough, and rather praiseworthy at the time, is that it actually didn't involve reasserting control over women, because Schlesinger actually thought that women too were undergoing a gender crisis during this period. And he thought that men just weren't paying enough attention to realize that, right? He says, no, women are just as distressed as we are, but we don't care about it. And Schlesinger actually said the solution is not to go back to patriarchy, because according to Schlesinger, quote, "masculine supremacy, like white supremacy, was the neurosis of an immature society." Okay, so he says the answer is not dominating women. Instead, Schlesinger had argued that men essentially needed to develop their individuality rather than remaining quote-unquote organization men. And his thought was, if you know enough about who you are, then you will develop a kind of security in yourself and security in your gender that will follow. Or as he put it, when a person begins to find out who he is likely to find out rather soon what sex he is. Okay? So this is a kind of, it's not posed in gender-neutral language, but it is a gender-neutral suggestion for how we can become more secure. If you are secure in yourself, then you're secure in your gender identity. And he also, as a way of achieving this, suggested that the key was for men to invest less in mass culture and in popular media and more in arts. So music, fine art, literature, classics, essentially. He said, look, television, advertising, all of this stuff does nothing but put pressure on you to keep up with the Joneses. It does nothing but reaffirm for you that you need to constantly be defining yourself by material possessions, by wealth, by what car you have, etc. If you look towards art, things that really encourage introspection, things that have a depth and a substance to them, then you will be able to start to develop an internal sense of identity, and that will reaffirm for you that you are who you think you are, right? That you are a man. Okay, so that's our first approach, right? Go back, reject mass media, reject the things that promote conformity, and really look within. But there's a second approach as well, and that's what I want to move on to now, and it's quite a different one. So not everybody did as Schlesinger did and approached the sort of quote-unquote crisis in masculinity by suggesting that men not blame women or suggesting that the crisis could simply be solved by encouraging men to look inward. Instead, some other people proposed a more dramatic rejection of the idea of marriage and of family-oriented suburban masculinity, without, as we'll say in a few minutes, necessarily rejecting the kind of consumerist aspects of that family-oriented suburban masculinity. And here I want to look at Playboy magazine. Now, Playboy was founded by Hugh Hefner in 1953, as many of you might know, and I think it exists in our popular imagination mostly as a magazine that featured a lot of nude women, or at least women in various states of undress, which it did. But Playboy did also have articles, and the old joke about reading it for the articles aside, some of them actually proposed a really interesting alternative vision of masculinity. And I say that because Playboy, you might be surprised to learn, actually hired some fairly prominent writers and social critics to talk about modern manhood, including a guy named Philip Wiley. Now, Philip Wiley was a novelist, a satirist, and a social diatribe writer, and he, unlike Schlesinger, did not explain the crisis of masculinity as a product of a kind of generalized existential angst on the part of modern people. Instead, he tended to explain men's anxiety and their failing sense of themselves as men as being the result of women's growing power, especially within the household. So Wiley at one point coined the term momism in his best-selling 1942 book Generation of Vipers. And what he was essentially criticizing with the term momism was what he perceived as women's tendency to become overcommitted to their children in a gender regime in which motherhood was supposed to be the center of their existence. In other words, he argued that because society so heavily stressed that women should be mothers and find fulfillment in child rearing, that in some cases they became almost unhealthily invested in their children to the point of obsession. And the result of this, Wiley claimed, was that you had a whole generation of sons who were stuck forever in a period of immature sissydom, unable to claim their own status as free American men, as husbands, as fathers, because they were just such mama's boys, essentially. And these women's husbands, in turn, these people who suffered from momism, their husbands were likely to feel neglected and dissatisfied, which drove men away from the home, caused them to lose faith in the marriage, and also alienated them from their children, which of course meant that a lot of boys grew up without strong male role models. And so he says this is part of what contributes to the ongoing crisis of masculinity, including the quote-unquote epidemic of homosexuality, right, as this momism. And he also blamed, interestingly enough, men's anxieties about masculinity on women's fascination with decorating their homes. So Wiley actually argued in 1958 that part of the reason that American men felt such a sense of dislocation and insecurity is that they actually had lost their spatial place in the world. And more specifically, they'd lost their place in their own homes. Wiley said essentially, look, now we have a system where men are supposed to spend their days at work in jobs that are often stultifying so that they can enjoy a more vibrant home life in the suburbs. But the places they came home to, the places where they were supposed to find their value and really enjoy their lives, didn't reflect their identities at all. Instead, they reflected the tastes of their wives. And Wiley wrote, where once a man had a den, maybe a library, a cellar pool room, his own dressing room, and good substantial floors and walls to protect his privacy, he now found himself in a split-level pastel creation with rooms, often created by screens his wife moved about as often as she changed her flower arrangements. He thereafter hardly ever knew where he was in his own home. All he knew was that the beloved old place now looked like a candy box. And, if you've ever seen 1950s homes, they do have a trend towards kind of pastel coloration. I'm going to skip forward here a little bit, but you can very much kind of see this sort of lots of soft greens, pinks, blues. And actually, I bring this up because nowadays I read an article recently about millennial pink, that millennials are kind of returning to this rough color palette because it reminds them of security, the security that comes with sort of childhood in some senses. But Wiley was essentially saying, look, we give women leave to decorate the home. We acknowledge that the home is their sphere. But what it means is that men don't have a place in it. I mean, even the walls change, right? Screens were very popular under sort of mid-century modern design styles. So he says essentially men have lost their place in their homes. They don't have a space at home. And so the very place that they're supposed to feel most secure is alien to them. And if you want to find, if this sounds silly to you, I think it shouldn't, because I don't know how many of you watch HGTV, but the concept of the man cave is very much rooted in this idea, right? Why is there no kind of equivalent to this? I guess the closest is she shed, but that's usually something that's outside of the house, which is acknowledged as the man's property. Typically, the yard, right, is a space associated with men. But within the house, men have to have their own spaces because the assumption is the rest of the house isn't theirs, right? The rest of the house is the woman's, and so men need a kind of shelter from this oppressive, family-oriented, feminine space. So we still have this notion a little bit, I would think. And a lot of Playboy readers and writers became kind of obsessed with the notion of the home as feminized. Playboy's William Iverson launched a very similar critique to Wiley's, in which he lamented the fact that private male spaces like studies had disappeared from the suburban home in favor of quote-unquote family rooms, with open layouts that encouraged interaction. And so you can see this here, right? This is kind of often how we think of the 1940s and 50s families, clustered around the TV in a family room. But Iverson didn't like this. He wrote, "What of this new brand of compulsive closeness, lauded as a social virtue and sweeping the country like a 7-year virus? Is it something you catch from sitting around a suburban living room watching the Lawrence Welk show? A mystic sense of oneness that comes from making a burnt offering of prime sirloin on an outdoor grill?" And so he essentially is saying here, right, he's lamenting kind of the rise of a more open concept home. He's lamenting the rise of family-oriented spaces instead of spaces that are masculine within the home. And he said essentially, this is one way in which we are demanding that Americans eradicate their individuality. We're denying them private spaces within the home, and more specifically, we're denying men those spaces. Iverson wrote, "The American home is becoming a boudoir kitchen nursery dreamed up by women for women as if males did not exist as males." And so he had a solution. He said that men should essentially reject this kind of togetherness and reject the feminized home in general. But one obvious question is, how were men supposed to do that exactly? What did it look like to reject the feminized home? Well, one of the possibilities involved claiming certain spaces either within the house or immediately outside the house as masculine spaces. So one of the favorite spaces to claim was the garage, which was frequently depicted as storage not just for the family car, but also for lots and lots of tools. The garage in suburban houses were supposed to be the man's spaces for tinkering. And, maybe this resonates with a lot of you. I'm curious to ask you in the Zoom conversation, how many of you associated, if you lived in a house with a garage, how many of you associated that as dad's space? I'm betting a lot. I never saw my mom really out in the garage a lot when I was a kid, but dad was always out there working on something, right? Now, the other thing that people did in many cases was they turned to home improvement and repair projects. So this is kind of the period that marks the birth of the home improvement industry. With home ownership rates rising rapidly, a lot of men found themselves for the first time taking care of their own maintenance. I mean, if you lived in a city before this, you probably rented an apartment, and in that case, just like now, you'd have a maintenance guy or a super to take care of that. But once people started buying their own homes, they started investing a lot in fixing them. Not building them with their own hands, but in making sure that everything was in working order. And Life magazine in 1954 proclaimed, probably not since pioneer days when men built their own log cabins, have men been so personally involved in their homes, right? So you're really supposed to care about the look of your house. And here, this is interesting because the suburban home in this formulation becomes the new frontier, whereas previously guys, broke ground on new farmland and built their own cabins. Now you tinker with the sink. You put in an AC system, right? This is the new masculine frontier. Another possibility, though, was actually rejecting the family home entirely. And Playboy, in particular, really espoused the idea that men should reject the notion of being husbands and fathers in favor of adopting another form of masculinity that we might call a kind of resistant form of masculinity, which was bachelor masculinity. Okay, so Playboy really glorified the bachelor, which is kind of interesting if we think about previous things we've discussed in this class. If we think about colonial America, you might recall that bachelors were actually thought of as people who are very dangerous, in part because they were associated with sexual licentiousness, they were not connected to families, which meant they weren't fulfilling their proper roles within society, etc. Well, Playboy is going to tap into some of those old associations, particularly the sexually liberated ones, and glorify the bachelor and popularize in many ways a different spatial arrangement that was really geared around his needs, something that you might recognize called the bachelor pad. Now, you may not know this because, again, we tend to remember Playboy, well, I shouldn't say remember, I think they're still publishing it, as a kind of magazine that's sort of scandalous, it publishes nudes, etc. But Playboy was actually kind of a premier architecture and design magazine when it first came out. In addition to interviewing very famous architects like Buckminster Fuller, Playboy also featured the designs of some of the most famous and eminent modern architects and interior designers of the mid-20th century. So the magazine, weirdly enough, spent a lot of time talking about furniture and a lot of time encouraging men to think about what their spaces should look like and to cultivate them in particular ways. And I always find this kind of interesting when you think about it, because nowadays we tend to think of interior design as being something that's very feminized. And really, a lot of people, even in the 20th century, mid-20th century, thought of it that way. Even now, there's a kind of stereotype that interior designers are either women or gay men in many cases in the popular imagination. But magazines like Esquire and Playboy actually did quite a lot to masculinize consumption and to really make interior design something that was manly, particularly for bachelors to think about. So let's look at how Playboy described its mission and focused on interior space in its early issues. The magazine featured this quote: "We don't mind telling you in advance. We plan on spending most of our time inside. We like our apartment. We enjoy mixing up cocktails and hors d'oeuvres or two and putting a little mood music on the phonograph and inviting in a female acquaintance for a quiet discussion on Picasso, Nietzsche, jazz, sex." Sounds dreadful to me, but whatever. The pretension just rolls off of it. But now, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and start showing some images of various interior design pieces that Playboy published throughout the years, focusing specifically on the 1962 Playboy townhouse. But what I would like to do from here on out is, if you're planning to join us in today's Zoom, go ahead and stop the video here and then go to our Zoom chat room and we'll look at some of these together and go over them. If you are planning to do the asynchronous option, I want you to keep watching the video because I'm going to show you some images that I'd like you to write about and think about as you go and do your discussion posts for this class. So again, if you're planning to do the Zoom, just stop here and go to the Zoom room, and I will see you there. If not, just keep watching. Okay, so Playboy published a feature on the Playboy townhouse in 1962, and it was sort of an idealized urban bachelor pad, and there were a number of images published of the interior, what it would look like, lots of details about the space, etc. So this is what the feature writer wrote in the Playboy townhouse piece. Quote, "A man's home is not only his castle, it is or should be the outward reflection of his inner self, a comfortable, livable, and yet exciting expression of the person he is and the life he leads. But the overwhelming percentage of homes are furnished by women. What of the bachelor and his need for a place to call his own? Here's the answer. Playboy's penthouse apartment, home for a sophisticated man of parts, a fit setting for his full life and a complement to his guests of both sexes. Here, a man perhaps like you could live in masculine elegance." Now, as I'm going to show you this house, you're going to see that indeed this would not be accessible to a lot of people because the house is insane, quite frankly. But in this first image, I just want you to pay attention to where it appears to be located. What is around it? How does it look from the outside? And think about how this particular vision of masculine elegance or masculine living captured by this quote suggests something about what a man was supposed to be in the 1950s and 1960s. How do you go about defining yourself as a man? What is required? What is the basis of sort of portraying yourself as masculine? And then the question here is, as we move on to the interior, what do you notice about this image and about the overall kind of aesthetics of this house? What is present in it? What is not present in it? How does it look, and how is that particular appearance supposed to portray a particular vision of masculine elegance? So take a look at this image. You can pause the video if you want, and then we will move on. Okay. So here is another interior shot of the townhouse. And again, take a look at the walls, take a look at the ceiling, what is present or missing from this image, how this room is designed to look. And as you're doing that, it might be good to contrast it with a kind of typical image of a 1950s suburban house, which is this one, right? Very typical in its color layout, in the way the kitchen looks, etc., and the way that it is designed. So if we cut back and forth between these two, right, the Playboy townhouse and the traditional 50s townhouse, what are some things that you notice? Here again we have another shot of the interior, and this is the bedroom of the Playboy townhouse, and this looks to be a seating area outside of the pool that is in the lower floor. So again, take a look at these. In what sense are these spaces masculine, and what does their functionality or the way that they are designed say about what are assumed to be the priorities of men during this time period? Okay. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting is that as you look at this house, one thing you might or might not notice is the ubiquity of bars. Almost every room in the Playboy townhouse has a bar along the side of it. And Playboy had this to say about that on the ubiquity of bars. Quote, "It permits the canny bachelor to remain in the room while mixing a cool one for his intended quarry. No chance of missing the proper psychological moment. No chance of leaving her cozily curled up on the couch with her shoes off and returning to find her mind changed, purse in hand, and the young lady ready to go home, damn it." So, when you think about this, what does this quote say about what men's ultimate goals are? What functions are the design of this house supposed to serve? And in what sense does the design of this house reinforce a particular version of what it means to be a man, what it means to be masculine, what it means to be a quote-unquote canny bachelor? Now, There's also a kitchen in this house, which is sort of interesting because we often think of kitchens as feminized spaces, right? These are more than any other part of the house. If the garage is the man's domain, the kitchen tends to be the woman's in a lot of quote-unquote traditional households. One thing that's really interesting about this that you might notice, though, is that there's really not much of an oven in this house. And this is because Playboy very rarely, when they wrote about food, wrote about baking. Baking is a feminine thing during this period. And additionally, you might also notice that the kitchen has a lot of gadgets. It has, among other things, an ultrasonic dishwasher, and it has a grill that is supposed to essentially rotate kebabs for you so that you can make food relatively automatically with minimal effort. So your dishes, you have an automated dishwasher, and you have this sort of kind of hibachi on your kitchen that makes it very easy to grill. See what you make of that. In what sense does this reflect a uniquely masculine kitchen design or aesthetic? And I also just want to share with you a couple of quotes that I think are quite funny. The author of the gourmet section really did his best during this time period to convince men that certain foods were inherently masculine and that cooking could be a kind of butch thing to do. And that author was Thomas Mario, who wrote, among other things, and I love these quotes, "A woman may make the best patty of chicken in the world, but it takes a man to place a thick shell steak over a bed of live ashen white charcoal." And then he also wrote, among other things, to convince men to eat vegetables. Actually, a good salad maker must have many of the traits and skills that we sometimes think of as feminine: meticulousness, patience, cleanliness, and a very alert sense of touch and taste. However, these are not exclusively feminine virtues, and for some reason, it takes a man to master the really fine art of the salad bowl. Yes, clearly. So, as you said, there's also a big fascination with gadgetry outside of the kitchen as well. You have these sort of, I don't even know what these are called, but basically music, hi-fi stations, I think. TVs. This is actually the bedroom, one of the other bedrooms of this house. So see what you make of this, what you notice about these images, and then write about them in your discussion posts. And I will see you next week.